Okay, thank you. Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I think I can say that safely because it's afternoon on both sides of the Atlantic now. Welcome to our closing panel of the third Latin America Conference of Chatham House. It's an honor to have you all here. It's an honor to have our panelists, and I hate to sound a little bit like a fanboy nerd, but I've been looking forward to this the entire time. We have an excellent panel that's going to take a global look at the effect of COVID, populism, state collapse on issues of human rights and democracy globally. I won't delay much longer in the introductions. They really don't need any introductions. There are very few people that you have that have risen to the level of global rock stars when it comes to human rights and democracy, but we have both of them here. First, we have President Bachelet, Michelle Bachelet, who was president twice of Chile, the first woman president of Chile. In between her terms, she was director, the head of UN Women, the first ever UN woman, and now she's a High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations. Next is Francis Fukuyama, who is a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, author of many, many books. I don't even dare to name them all. And also author most recently of a series of very good articles in The Atlantic on the effects of COVID on democracy and the differences between how governments and states themselves have responded. I'm going to open up with a question to both of you. It starts with first, President Bachelet, if you look at the patterns of human rights abuses, the ones that you've very bravely and consistently called out. You have issues in cases of Syria and Libya and Yemen, cases of conflict. You also have cases in Venezuela of the collapse of state and what you call the crimes against humanity. You have instances of ethnic cleansing, if you will, in Myanmar. To what extent do you feel these are trends and patterns that are discernible? What do you think are the causes of them? And I'll ask the same of you, Francis, also with an eye towards populism. So President Bachelet, please.
Well, thank you, Christopher. I think that there are two different things. On one hand, you have problems, the politicization, if I may say, of human rights. So, and because the international community is very polarized politically, there are governments and leaders who seek to dispute international human rights norms that have been long settled. Some people say that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a Western construction, and that's not it. The commissioners were from all parts of the world: Chile, Peru, but also China, India. Very interesting, I have to mention this because the person who changed, because at that time the people spoke about les droits de l'homme, the rights of the man, and I would say the women, Indian women. She said, no, if you use that, it will be used against women. So please include the word human beings. So it's so there's very interesting things. So it's not a Western construction. I mean, and human rights are universal, but many people discuss that, say that they're not universal, that those issues are sovereign, that they're in the domestic problems, and they shouldn't be, and that we shouldn't be monitoring and reporting or naming and shaming, etc. So I think there is a political issue on one hand, but on the other hand, and of course as well, I think that the withdrawal of the US also produces certain effects of the Human Rights Council. But on the other hand, we have trends that are very concerning and that they're not new. I mean, we always knew about the inequalities and the violation of human rights or abuse of human rights because of those very big inequalities that have been laid bare now with COVID-19, but we all knew those were happening. What happens in many places, though, is that we have seen the increase of hate speech, xenophobia, anti-migrants, and that is inciting violence against some of these minorities, like in Myanmar, for example, or like some Muslims in India and other places of the world. So the world, it's complicated because I think it's too polarized, and there's very difficult capacity of the international community to be able to really act. For example, I've been doing a statement, and the Secretary General, on Ethiopia, calling on the ceasefire and the cease of the hostilities, because both parts are violating human rights and their abuses. So I think there is a difficult, I don't know if it's a structural, I think it's a structural, on the world order today, that means that the tools that the international community has to avoid those conflicts or solve easily those conflicts is very fragile. It's very fragile. And the other issue is when you have leaders of the world who sort of diminish the importance of human rights in their words, that gives like permission to others to do the same. So I think it's a mix of situations that we can see. But on the other hand, we do have a human rights system that is working. We have all those places that you mentioned, we do have commissions of inquiry or fact-finding missions, and that try to support the victims, to give them justice, to redress them, to ensure accountability for the perpetrators. So it is an issue. And I think one of the biggest problems as well is a lack of accountability, because then it doesn't matter what I do, because nothing is going to happen. So that's something that you see not only in this big conflict, you can also see it in places where, unfortunately, there's a lot of homicides on journalists or human rights defenders. When there is impunity, lack of accountability, it's easier for them to continue doing that. On the other hand, of course, women are particularly affected because in many places sexual violence is very high, and that continues, unfortunately, today.
Let me ask, before I turn to you, Frank, sort of a follow-up question. Because as you say, clearly your role still has a certain moral authority. It's amazing, despite all these concerns about geopolitics and the politicization, even the weaponization of human rights in the cases of the US, China, people still clamor to have the High Commissioner issue a statement to visit when it was possible. You're still a focal point of that sort of attention, world attention. How do you think that translates? And do you think is the problem the lack of follow-up that you're talking about, or is it simply overall trying to find a voice in a cacophony of competing demands and visions of human rights?
Well, thank you for asking that, Christopher, because I think that you have a sort of a curious situation. On one hand, some trying to, even now in the context of COVID-19, use as an excuse COVID-19 to violate political civil rights like freedom of expression, freedom of press, and so on. But on the other hand, the people really are more conscious of their rights and want to be sure that their rights are respected. And they're willing to demand these rights. They're willing to organize themselves to demand the rights for themselves, but also for the others. And also they're willing to see accountability for violation. I think this is also a clear trend worldwide. But in that case, it's not only an issue of government. I think one of the problems that we have is that we have seen shrinking of civic space, because we do need a very vibrant civil society that can, bottoms up, demand those rights and demand accountability for when there are being violations of human rights. And so I think this is center for in COVID and without COVID, to keep people at the center of policies, to give them voice, participation, and we try to do that. We try to do our best to protect human rights defenders, for example, on all kinds: environmental, land rights, indigenous rights, or women's rights, and so on. So we try to do that, and but we think we need all of us to work in a different position and on different levels to create sort of a second way. I have to tell you that because I define myself as a strategic optimistic, sometimes tactically I'm not so optimistic when I see the world. I thought maybe the COVID-19 pandemic can create the same sense that it was during the development of the Universal Declaration. It was the wars who created this sense that we cannot repeat these horrors. So which are sort of the minimal standards of living together that we respect, and then they create the Universal Declaration. So I thought maybe there was another push, because we are really receiving a lot of pushback on human rights for many governments. And so I thought this may be, I thought also that this could mean that everybody would understand that for global challenges, you need global cooperation, and that hasn't happened either. And the multilateralism is more important than ever. But I think we need to navigate in this. That's the world today, and we need to navigate on that and try to find the best strategies for that.
I want to return to that point of potential optimism at the end, and proposals for perhaps trying to recapture some sense of a global commitment, a social contract, if you will, that renews these, given political dynamics. Francis, your thoughts on the trends we're seeing both pre-COVID and in the midst of COVID and the reasons behind them, the factors that are explaining them.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. Let me just start by saying that it's a great honor to be on the same panel with President Bachelet. I visited her a few years ago in La Moneda when she was still president. And at that time, I remember we talked about the potential constitutional reform. And I'd like to congratulate Chile on having voted overwhelmingly for that reform. It's a great achievement that you've done that. And I think it will mean a new beginning for democracy in Chile. And Chris, I have one correction to my biography. I am not at the Hoover Institution. They are way too conservative for me. I'm at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. So just to get that.
Okay, I get
just to make that.
The confusion is always the Hoover Tower is always defined as Stanford, and that's to be part of it.
So I think that there have been several phenomenon that have been very negative for human rights in recent years. The one is simply the rise of major geopolitical actors that are authoritarian. They're consolidated, they're powerful, and they have lots of ways of spreading their influence. And that is primarily Russia and China. They extend their influence in different ways. So, for example, the Russians have figured out how to use social media as a weapon to intervene in the elections of democratic countries, beginning with the United States. China has, in a way, a bigger arsenal of tools because it's a bigger country and richer. So they can use kind of propaganda influence. They can use money. The Belt and Road Initiative extends to virtually every region of the world. It does good things. They build infrastructure that's desperately needed by poor countries, but it's also a way of extending Chinese influence and affecting the decision-making ability of democratic countries. So, for example, because of their activities in Eastern Europe, where they've been heavily involved in the so-called 16+1 process, it's become impossible for the EU to criticize China for treatment of Uyghurs or over Tibet, because one of those Eastern European countries is likely to veto that outcome. So that's one set of challenges. The other is the rise of populism in the leading democratic countries, beginning with the United States, with the election of Donald Trump back in 2016, with the British vote on Brexit, with the shifts that have gone on in Hungary and Poland, and the presence of populist parties in virtually every European democracy. The reason that this is a problem is that you have democratically elected and therefore democratically legitimated leaders that then go on to attack the rule of law, primarily the rule of law institutions, which obviously is the foundation for the observation of human rights in any country. Typically a populist leader says, well, I won the election, I represent the people, and here is a court that's standing in my way, or here's a media that's criticizing me, here's a bureaucracy that won't do what I want, and then they use their executive power to try to undermine the power and the legitimacy of those institutions. And we've seen this happen, unfortunately, in a way the furthest in Hungary, where the ruling party has extended its control over the dominant media, over the court system, and is able to preserve itself in power through gerrymandering and the like. Unfortunately, we've seen the attempt to do this in the United States. I think Donald Trump came into office attacking virtually every institution that got in his way: the FBI, the Justice Department, the regular bureaucracy, the court system, the mainstream media were enemies of the American people. So this is all very familiar rhetoric coming from a populist leader that really claims this direct mantle of legitimacy representing the people, but does not like to be restricted by a rule of law. And so it's as if the democratic part of liberal democracy was rising up to attack the liberal part and dismantling all of those rules that limit power and executive authority. And then finally, as President Bachelet said, the COVID epidemic has accelerated these trends because, obviously when a nation faces a massive threat like a disease, it needs a centralized source of authority to respond. And this has given lots of leaders in many countries, both authoritarian and democratic, a good excuse to extend executive power, like Viktor Orban's parliament, which voted him emergency powers very early on in the crisis. So I think you've got, unfortunately, a whole variety of threats that have been developing over the last decade or even longer that are now intensifying as many of these trends consolidate and play out.
Christopher, may I add something?
Please, I was going to ask you.
And I want to ask Francis what he thinks about it. And of course, I told you before, but I want to repeat it now, how honored it is for me to be here with you and to see you again. Because one thing that I have discovered, that I've seen, is when there are uncertainties in the world, in the economy, in the insecurity, in which area, there are people who react looking for strong men, for strong policies, not very democratic. Because I find it very threatening that in many countries you have mentioned, I'm not going to mention, and the UN, they are supported by so many millions of people. So they really use that excuse, as you said. Governments, no, but they elected me because they believe in what I believe and so on. So, but the question that I ask myself is, how come that some people reacting that way? Because probably they feel that makes them safer, that gives them more opportunities. And that is used by many of these leaders to communicate certain narratives that make people believe that, or lies in some cases, that make people believe that will be true. Because I've seen it in my country. When there were problems with delinquency, people would have said, for example, in democracy, not many people, but some people, oh, if General Pinochet will be here, this would not be happening. And I've seen it in many places of the world. And on the other hand, what I do believe, though, is that we do have a crisis of politics because democracy has not been, I would say, delivering, and neither the economic system has been delivering. So many people is really, the credibility of what used to be sort of the core of the institution in the past, now they have really small credibility, and we have seen in 80 countries last year, movements of people without parties protesting on the street. So I think it's a mix of situation, some because they feel their rights are not respected, some because they feel that these strong people will give them more safety and certainties. But the truth is that we are living in very uncertain times, and this will continue.
Yes, well, I think that's obviously a lot of what drives the current rise of populism. I would say it's a mixture of fear and resentment. And actually, part of that resentment is deserved, because I do think that in many places, elites tend to live in big cities, and they're well educated, and they're not vulnerable to the kinds of economic shocks that many working class people have been subject to, and they begin to lose touch with people on the outside and look down on them. And I think actually culturally, there's been this huge divide that has appeared in very many countries, beginning with the United States, but it's true in Britain, it's true in Hungary, many other places, between kind of sophisticated, educated people in cities and people living in, smaller rural communities and the like. And fear is an important part, because I think that, if you listen to the rhetoric on both sides in the election that we just had in the United States, both the left and the right, the red America and the blue America, were both talking in apocalyptic terms, especially on the right, where many people said, the United States is not going to survive a democratic victory. Like the United States that we knew and understood and loved is simply going to disappear. It's, I mean, there was a fear, I think, on the other side as well that, a populist leader like Donald Trump would basically destroy the rule of law in the United States. I frankly think that that was a more reasonable thing to worry about. But there's no question that people interpreted policy differences in really apocalyptic terms. And one of the strange things that's been going on in the United States and in other countries is, the manifestation of this fear in terms of these very bizarre conspiracy theories where people end up believing, just absurd stories that, basically fortify things that they believe already about how evil people on the other side are. There's this QAnon conspiracy in the US that's now spreading to other countries that, the Democrats are drinking the blood of children in secret tunnels under Washington, D.C. And this is something that now a significant number of Americans believe. And so that's it may start with resentment, but then I think you're right that it evolves into fear. And it's also driven, I would say, by technology, because with the rise of the internet, you can say anything you want on the internet. All the intermediaries, the media channels and the government agencies and the sources of information that people used to trust are simply not, it's easy to get around them and they're not trusted any longer. So I think all of these things have contributed to that kind of, it's a perceived existential conflict. I don't think it's an existential conflict at all, but somehow it's been interpreted that way in very many countries.
Let me ask somewhat of a multifaceted question to both of you. Drawing on what you just said, Francis, and your points, President Bachelet. The first is we're seeing populist governments attack multilateral institutions by either blocking their funding, pulling out, demanding sort of an America first or the country first, nationalism or national sovereignty over notions of popular sovereignty. Part of that is populism, this idea of fear of the other, economic insecurity. We're also at the same time seeing the issue of the, if you will, the erosion of a notion of rights, of the centrality of a wide web of rights. And President Bachelet, you've worked on this and you speak passionately about this issue of women's rights. To what extent do you see even now, of course, you focus on the most egregious cases of human rights abuses, Syria, Libya, and the like. But to what extent do you see sort of the organic, cohesive nature of these rights? How the erosion of women's rights, the erosion of what seemingly are distant rights to the core democracy rights, which aren't, but are sort of being attacked, whether it's LGBTI rights, attacked in many of these populist countries under notions of conservatism, conservative religious ethos, as sort of being fundamentally weakening the larger project of human rights and democratic stability. You don't need to name countries in particular, but to what extent do you see these as being connected, if you will, sort of warning signs on the road to larger issues of human rights decay of the sorts of countries that you focus on? And the same I want to ask of you, Francis, but President Bachelet?
Well, first of all, because I was in UN Women, I have to tell you that women's rights, gender equality has been under attack for not just now, for some decades. And it was surprising for me because after we're going to have this year 20 years of the resolution of the Security Council 1325 on women, peace, and security, and 25 years after Beijing. And Beijing was a big step forward. But then afterwards, they started all these countries trying to to diminish the importance of women's rights and the child's rights. But I think now, with COVID-19, this has increased dramatically because women has been dramatically affected, disproportionately affected, because they usually work much more on the informal economy, and that the informal economy have been really affected by the lockdowns, because they work on areas that tourism, restaurant, etc., that have been affected, have been had to lock down, because the domestic violence has increased dramatically inside and with the lockdowns, and because women has lost more jobs than men. So ILO feels that probably women will lose many of the gains on women's rights in the past because of the COVID-19 and the measures that have been taken by some governments. So you still see in Poland, for example, the fight for abortion, sexual and reproductive health services. And of course, people went to the street, protested against it, and the government stopped moving in that direction. So I think this is a trend that comes before. There has been, as everything, as all inequalities that we have seen, have been, on one hand, being seen, but on the other hand, have been aggravated, exacerbated now by the COVID-19 pandemic. And as also, well, let me tell you a little anecdote. When I was Minister of Health, I participated in a high-level summit in the UN on HIV/AIDS. And the resolution was structured because there was a discussion between the Nordics that wanted to include LGBTI rights and sexual commerce, and at that time, I don't know which countries exactly, but let me say Muslim countries or from the Middle East countries, that they were completely against mentioning any of this. There are other important in the past. The church, the Catholic Church, also did not accept the concept gender and gender in general. So it was, all those discussions were there. But what I'm going to tell you that when I arrived at UN Women, there was another, like 15 years later, there was another high-level summit on HIV/AIDS. And can you believe me? They have a huge epidemic. They were still discussing the same exact issue. So we have here ideological issues, economic issues, religious issues. That means that the most vulnerable groups of society are still being left behind. And it's very difficult because you still have that issue. When we discuss in the Human Rights Council, I mean, governments discuss, we present, they discuss as an intergovernmental organization, you still see this division. There is a mix of things. And on one hand, you can see, but on the other hand, you see the Me Too, a lot of movements in the street. So I think it's a political, it's an ideological, religious thing, but it also, we have youth that is really pushing in the right direction on gender equality, on climate action, and so on. So that's why I'm strategically optimistic, because I think that sometimes at this moment is not the best, but it will, if we maintain vibrant people, saying what they feel, moving around, organizing. Now it's very difficult that we have not a freedom of mobility much bigger. We cannot include that. But I mean, at least you can do it through social media, through other ways, work with parliament so we can really improve the human rights concepts and I would say convictions that we had in the past. But maybe I have asked myself the following. Maybe we thought it was like that. Maybe you always had people who do not believe in human rights. And I truly believe that they really were xenophobic, anti-migrants, anti-women's rights, etc. But it was politically incorrect to say it. They were racist, but it was politically incorrect. It was not accepted. But they thought the same way they think now. So, and as I said before, but when you have also global leaders that say the same things, you give permission to the people to really express what they really feel and they really think.
Yes, that's very powerful points. Francis, your thoughts? And we want to remind the audience, please post questions. I'm getting a few of them already. We also have a poll that should be posted in the chat line, so please answer that. But Frank, your comments, your reactions.
Well, it seems to me that one of the big problems with international institutions right now is the withdrawal of the United States that President Bachelet referred to. If you look at the history of many of those institutions, beginning with the United Nations, the United States, as the most powerful country in the post-World War II period, was really critical in establishing it. And there's actually in international relations a lot of theory about how you actually need a dominant, powerful player in order to create the conditions for real international cooperation. Now that position, that hegemonic position, kind of reached its peak, between 1991 and let's say 2008. But since then, the United States has been withdrawing. It didn't begin with Donald Trump. I think many Americans themselves felt that the United States was overextended by these wars that it got involved in the Middle East. But then there was a kind of principled isolationism that had always been latent in American politics that came to the fore with Trump's election. And it's not clear what's going to fill the vacuum. In many respects, I think it is going to be China. So, one of the I think really terrible decisions that the Trump administration took was to pull out of the TPP virtually on the first day after its election. And it's interesting the way that's worked out, because the TPP was actually conceived in the Obama administration as a kind of barrier. It was the rule of law countries in the Asia Pacific region that would work with each other, and it excluded China. And so it was actually kind of a barrier to make sure that China had incentives to observe, certain common rules. The United States pulls out of it, and all of a sudden it turns out that there's now this new regional comprehensive economic partnership that the same East Asian countries have now negotiated among themselves that excludes the United States and includes China. And so we've kind of ended up with, the exact opposite of, what this administration, ostensibly desires. I think you can tell a similar story with the WHO. I do think that there were real problems in China's influence early on in January in the epidemic, and getting the WHO to kind of downplay the seriousness of what had happened in Wuhan. But then, the United States withdraws, and it leaves kind of a clear field for China then to have much more influence. I think properly what the United States should have done, as in other international organizations, is to stay fully engaged even when you're not happy with, some of the ways that these organizations are governed, and play the game, stay involved, and then work with other like-minded democratic countries to increase the influence and impact of democratic norms in cooperative institutions. I think that when Biden becomes president, a lot of this is going to change. I think the easiest thing he can do, because he has clear authority over foreign policy, is to reinsert the United States into the WHO, into the Paris Climate Accords, to reaffirm traditional American alliances and so forth. But I don't think that there is going to be really a return to the pre-2016 situation, because in the United States, the bipartisan consensus in favor of this kind of leadership and heavy international involvement has, in many ways broken down in a way that will survive, Donald Trump losing the presidency. And so it's going to put a premium, I think, on other democratic countries to work with one another to fix their own institutions. And, in a certain way, that's not the worst thing in the world. If countries, that in a way could free ride because they knew the United States would always be there for them, now have to worry about taking care of themselves, it may produce some new configurations in global politics that will, allow other democratic countries to fill that vacuum.
President Bachelet, you have the advantage of having been president twice, sitting now twice in a multilateral institution. I guess the first question I have is, if you had the ear of President-elect Joe Biden, and you probably do, directly or indirectly, what would you tell him to do if you dare to do this? I realize it's tricky. Then the question is would it matter? I mean, it is, as Francis was saying, it is contingent now on a broader coalition of countries. And our president at Chatham House, Robin Niblett, has written about the call for D10, Democracy 10. Is that sufficient? Is there a way to rejuvenate the faith internationally in human rights and democracy and multilateralism? And is there a need also then for education at the grassroots level about human rights and democracy, which clearly has been lacking?
Well, I'm not sure that I will be talking to him personally, but I know him very well, because when he was vice president, President Obama gave him the relationship with Latin America. He went to Latin America many times, and every time he wanted certain advice, he said he would call me to ask me about different countries and so on. So, but I mean, if I had the answer to that, I think I would be part of Joe Biden's government, because I don't have the answer. But I would say, first of all, it will be very difficult, because you will be confronting a situation that we all know, economic, social, economic, and the COVID, and COVID is going very bad over there. And on the other hand, he won the election, yes, but he has all this situation that's not being considered by President Trump until now. And there's a lot of people who think differently. There's a lot of people who voted for President Trump. So it won't be easy. And as Francis just said, there has been this broken consensus, I believe, not only on human rights and on internationalism, but also on many other issues. Because sometimes you see things that are not according to rule of law, and and his party doesn't say anything. It just keep quiet. So I think there's a lot of difficulty. So I would say, surround yourself with the best people you can. That's crucial, because president needs advisors or experts who can really help in thinking different strategies for different problems that you have to deal with. Come back to the multilateral system, and he has said it, as Francis was mentioning. He has said that they're going to go back to Paris Agreement, and that's great news for climate change. Because, as a matter of fact, even though the U.S. withdrew from Paris Agreement, many companies, big companies in the U.S., still maintain the same commitments. And we work a lot with business and human rights, business and SDGs and the Agenda 2030. I think that and I'm sure he will do, because he has been an expert of foreign relationship. I mean, he has been in the Senate, in the House on foreign relationships, so he knows pretty well. And I think he understands pretty well that the global challenges need global response. And I hope he also can play a positive way, positive attitude in something that we have been calling for, and it is that the COVID-19, we don't know when we will have the vaccine. There's these two good news, but it should be considered like a global public good. Because if you only think for my people, you're not going to solve the problem. So I believe that he has the capacity, he has expressed it, to relate differently with multilateral system. We can always fix and improve the organizations. We always can do that. That's not an issue. And nothing is perfect. Neither in the US, the human rights are, either in the US, they're violated. We have lots of allegations of different Native Americans, and we are doing a report on police brutality. And after George Floyd's death, the Human Rights Council mandated us to make a very strong report on this. And so there are issues. So I would say, concentrate on the issues that are important for the people, and help and go back to the multilateral system. Well, the mayor of Paris, when she heard the news, she said, America came back. So I think there's a lot of hope on Joe Biden and Kamala Harris election to really, they can play a much more stronger role in terms of leading, first of all, because I think the US lost leadership. The military said that when there is a hill, there is a vacuum, they take the hill. And as you were saying, I was remembering, Francis, because I read today an article about the RCP, but not only the RCP, but also this the regional cooperation, but also the transatlantic. It's a new FTA that where there is China and Japan together. And it's very interesting because they usually were not. So it's a lot of people there. So yes, I think the US will have to think about it. I'm not sure what the decisions will make. I guess that one of the more difficult decisions in foreign policy for the US will be how they relate to China, because I think there is a structural problem. It's not a contingent problem. It's not everything caused by the Trump administration. I think that some time ago, the US started feeling that China was rising and that the current multilateral system does not work fantastically. And that's my impression. That is much more strategic. So we are discussing in the UN which are the kind of strategies, which are the kind of things we can do, and what does it mean to build back better? Because when we're talking about COVID-19, we said, look, we cannot go back to the 0 day, because that is a world full of inequality, full of violation of human rights, full of all these conditions that permitted that because of lack of investment in health, public health, because of lack of preparedness, etc., we have seen what we have seen. So, and of course, because as I said before, last year, before COVID-19, we have so many people on the streets protesting because of democratic failures, or corruption, or because of economic problems and social rights not being able to be achieved by people. So the thing is that I would say education is key. I think for human rights, education is key from the first ages of life, no? But maybe the second is political will. So how do we build political will? And we need to build that better. That means that we need to think on how we improve our capacities as international community, and of course in the UN, but others as well. And it's very interesting because you see, for example, Kristalina Georgieva in IMF. She is revising things that were like written in stone before for the IMF. So I think there are opportunities that nobody has the answer yet, complete answer, but there's been discussed in many areas, in many OECD, in many different platforms, that in this building back better, how we ensure better political system, better economic system, how we ensure how we ensure climate emergencies, how we ensure that people who are more vulnerable and that the insect accepting, because everybody says yes, indigenous or women or older people, people living with disabilities, LGBTI, people in prisons, refugees, IDPs, the migrants are the worst affected by the virus. But the question is, and that is something that I'm like a preacher, because I think governments don't have the data. Women, and they can have the data of women, not in every place, but they don't have the intersecting force. What if you are a woman, old, living with disabilities, living poor, indigenous? I mean, all that information is not there. And I'm really concerned that if we don't have more information, any policy that's done to respond to the crisis and to the recovery will be leaving a lot of people behind. Those who are being more affected will continue to be left behind. But the other is a discussion that is a going on process. But I would say participate in that discussion, help us with your spirit, and count on us. I have a lot of hope, I have to say.
So for a couple questions that I want to get to, and then I'm going to end, we'll end on that. I want to first report on the poll. We did a poll among all the viewers. The question was, what should be the priority items on the multilateral cooperation agenda for Latin America over the next 4 years? 62% of the respondents said coordinated action on structural reform and poverty alleviation. 23% said human rights and democracy. 12% said action on climate change, and 4% said international trade. Now, obviously, many of those are linked, so they're not mutually exclusive, but clearly, structural reform and poverty alleviation is very much on the minds of many of the participants, and I think also Latin Americans. The question is then how you link that to the other issue of human rights and democracy. And on that, I want to combine a number of questions. We had one question from D. Smith, who asked how the growth of sort of the growing autonomy of power centers like China and India and other countries now that are sort of breaking away and not necessarily cooperating, how is that changing the dynamics around cooperation on issues such as pandemics and the like, and regional cooperation on those issues? Another question that came in is, what could be the role of middle powers? And it's funny, I saw you, President Bachelet, nod your head when Francis was talking about U.S. pulling out of TPP. Of course, it was your leadership that really helped form the TPP on the negotiations. And Chile has been, in many ways, a leader punching far above its diplomatic weight in many cases on leading on issues of regional integration and free trade and the like. So interested in hearing your thoughts on sort of the role of regional powers and middle powers, if you will, on sort of forming these coalitions to support rights. And the last question is the issue was raised by Melanie Avila. It's a question of what to do with what COVID means and the responses mean for issues of women's rights. We've seen the rise, and you mentioned this, President Bachelet, of domestic abuse, issues of femicide. What does this portend for the future, even on those rights? And you've, again, written and worked extensively on this and beautifully on this, so I want to hear your thoughts. And then I want to end with my last question, using or abusing my role as chair, if you will. And that is, let's try to end on a happy note. Not a happy note, but at least a positive note. If you were to do what you said, President Bachelet, and convert this into COVID moment into a moment for dramatic, far-reaching change, what would be your proposal, both of you, your proposal that could seize this unique moment in history to try to address some of the problems that we've all identified, whether it's questions of extending human rights and making them more relevant to people, rebuilding the multilateral system, which is frayed, and the norms around them, which have clearly become more attenuated. What would you do? So 3 questions: the rise of independent, more autonomous powers, sectors of power that are reshifting geopolitics, the role of middle powers, feminization, and then my abuse of my role as a chair on sort of proposal and politics. Dr. Fukuyama, I'm going to turn to you first.
Well, let me take the first of those questions, what the kind of multi-centric world implies. First of all, we've been moving in this direction for quite some time. And I think that the hegemony that the United States exercised, especially in that period between the fall of the Berlin Wall and, let's say, the financial crisis in 2008, I think it was a strange and not normal distribution of power. At that point, the United States was spending more on its military than all of the other countries in the world, and it held outsized, influence in many areas. And I think that, in many ways, that's not a good situation. It's better to be in a more multipolar world in which there's some balance and pushback. And I think you saw the bad effects of this with the Iraq invasion. The Iraq invasion could not have taken place during the Cold War because the Soviet Union would have opposed it and there would have been a danger of escalation, and the United States would have been much more cautious. But because of that apparent hegemony, the United States, made one of the biggest, I think, foreign policy blunders of recent memory. And so I don't think a multipolar world is one to fear. However, I do think, just specifically on the question of China, a lot of people argue that the United States has gotten more hostile to China because they're seeing a rising power and they're jealous of the former role that they played. And that's the reason for taking a more confrontational stance. That's true to some extent, but I actually think that there is an ideological issue underlying this that is related to the question of human rights. I think up until the rise of Xi Jinping in 2013, China had developed into a kind of ordinary authoritarian country. It didn't have its own model. It wasn't espousing an ideology for export. It was really focused on its own growth. But since Xi took over, I think it has moved in a very, very liberal direction, where the Communist Party has inserted itself throughout Chinese society as a much more assertive foreign policy, and one that is not democratic, and one that denies the basic premise that President Bachelet referred to about the universality of human rights. And so I think it's not an accident that democratic countries that do share those values are going to be skeptical of a lot of Chinese initiatives. And so, nobody should be eager to return to a Cold War situation where the world is polarized, but I do think that this ideological split between China and the democratic countries of the world is going to structure world politics. And it's going to mean, for example, that Europe can't just be floating out there saying, okay, well, we'll cooperate with China on some issues and we'll cooperate with the United States on other issues. I do think there's a kind of deeper tie that is going to bind fundamentally liberal democratic countries together. So that's, I think my answer to that question.
I made it up until the last minute of the conference and I failed to unmute myself. President Bachelet, your final remarks on that range of questions.
Well, yes, one thing I want to mention to add to what Francis Villama has mentioned is that I thought that when the European Union was created and when the bipolar system disappeared, that we will have a multipolar, but I haven't seen it yet. I mean, in practice. I mean, the European Union has not played the role. I mean, they try to do a lot, but they haven't played this role as a third power, if I may say, or a fourth power. And then you see they're starting creating a lot of other organizations, the G7, the G20, but I don't know if they have worked really, to be honest. I haven't seen much concrete results on that. On the feminization issue, I will try to touch the ones that you haven't touched. I would say yes, the COVID-19 has affected women on violence, as you said, on the informal economy, on the loss of jobs, and many women that has to take care of the children because the schools are closed. They have had to leave or the job or only work partially. So that's why we believe that and women have less salaries because they have an informal economy. They don't have social protection schemes, so they have no benefits. And so that's why for me to fight for gender equality and women's rights is so important, because we believe that they're much more vulnerable in many societies. And on proposals, just little ones, I think we need to build back better with some of the things that I said. We need an economy that is greener and sustainable. We need to really do climate action, but we also need to build social protection schemes, because we see that people, and particularly the most vulnerable, don't have any access to benefits. And what many governments have been doing all this time is small little subsidies, only temporary, but they're not going to solve. So I said social protection scheme, while at the meantime, try to tackle and address the root causes so poverty alleviation was mentioned, but I would say poverty alleviation, but also educational systems of quality, public health system of quality, so we can ensure that economic and social human rights are also respected, but civil and political, of course, but also social and economic, because I feel that many of the unrest that we have seen in the world, many of the problems that we've seen, many of the causes of conflict are also based on inequalities. Could it be inequalities based on social economic issues, on religious issues, on rural versus urban, as mentioned Professor Fukuyama. So I think we need to look at that, because people want the rights to be respected. And I think they're not accepting anymore that not happening. So that are some of my proposals.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Let me say one of the things that came out of yesterday's meeting is that perhaps the possibility of, given the fiscal strains that many governments are going to be under in Latin America, is tying debt relief to these sorts of social programs. Much the same way in an earlier era, debt relief was tied to neoliberal reforms, is rethinking social contracts in a way that IMF and private lenders or a Brady-type plan could help sort of provide the incentive for these more aggressive, progressive social protections for people that are obviously, we now realize, thanks to COVID, we need. Before I thank you both, I just want to thank Corporación Andina de Fomento for supporting this initiative, as well as the supporters of the Latin American Initiative, Fresnillo, HSBC, BTG Pactual, Wintershell DEA, Cairn Energy, Equinor, and Diageo. And I want to tell both of you also, next year we hope to do this in Mexico. So if we do it in Mexico, which we will, I hope to treat you to tacos al pastor and a tequila, and hope to see you both there in person. Thank you both very, very much for your thoughts, your commitment to these issues, intellectually, personally, professionally. It is a great honor to have chaired this panel and to be on the panel with both of you, both of whom I've admired over the years. So thank you both very, very much.
Thank you, Christopher. Can I add a little thing that I forgot on the proposals?
Yes, please.
Progressive tax reforms, because you can create fiscal space. Also, I mean, you can be helped by international community and organizations, but you can also create fiscal space if you do progressive tax reforms.
And that goes for the United States as well. I just want to add that. We need to roll back some of those tax cuts. Thank you both very, very much for a delightful panel.
Okay,
I am
thank
excited,
you.
very honored. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.